Today, Dr. Kendig is with us to deliver a talk entitled Philosophical Investigations in Ethnobotany. Dr. Kendig.
Thank you so much. That's both generous and incredibly embarrassing. But I'm super excited to be here and that you guys decided to be here rather than starting your spring break early. I wanted to talk about philosophical investigations of ethnobotany, focusing on lichens. So lichens, you might think, well, why? Why focus on lichens? Lichens are basically have long been relied upon as a source of food, used as medicine since before Hippocrates, and they've been used as the basis of textile dyes by rural communities such as the Sami, the Limba, and the Sherpa, as a material from which litmus dye is derived and used as an indicator of acidity and alkalinity. Initially, it's identified as a single organism and given binomial names by Linnaeus in 1753. But now lichens were later characterized as compound beings or symbionts by Schwendener in 1869. So defined it as a symbiotic system, a lichen includes a fungus, or a mycobiont, and a photosynthetic partner, or a photobiont, such as algae or cyanobacteria. The standard view has been that lichens are systems that have one fungus, typically an ascomycete or a basidiomycete. The lichen symbiont, as an organic whole, is treated as a non-Linnaean kind, a grouping of biological objects to which Linnaean nomenclature does not legitimately apply. Rather than a grouping with its own uniquely identifying classificatory rules, lichens are named as if they were fungi or lichenizing fungi. This means that formal naming practices of the lichen symbiont rely on knowing that it is a photobiont mycobiont symbiote, but also privileging the role of certain mycobiont parts of the symbiont over others in terms of its naming practice. So I want to explore how lichens are named and classified using institutional as well as indigenous naming practices. I want to pay close attention to what purposes these practices are used, how they are employed, what ontological commitments they rely upon to do so, and what grounds we have for relying on these different ontologies. Because lichens have been and continue to be classified outside the Linnaean system by both lichenologists and indigenous communities, the use of gray names is frequent and persistent. Gray names are usually understood as names that are intentionally or accidentally non-Linnaean. As such, there is strong motivation for exploring ways that retain these kind of non-Linnaean naming practices and the information encoded by them by different communities. But if we take these names to provide information, how are they able to do so when the purpose for which they have been named differs? The communities who name them differ, and the ontologies which they employ to do so also differ. And what are the stakes that must be considered for any attempt to preserve, retain, or compare the information contained in these names in a way that preserves their source-specific informational content? Before attempting to answer these questions, I want to talk a little bit about the justification for why I, and perhaps some of you, might be interested in naming practices. Okay, so a biological name, whether formal or vernacular, contains information about what is known, what is valued, and how it is used. Nomenclature provides a label that codes those things that we know about, whether we are using it as a scientific name or a vernacular name. Naming provides a means by which biological entities can be identified, referred to, and used within a community. The names identify types of entities that one uses in one's way of life. As a label that is affixed to something, the meaning and import, as well as its informational content, seems to be grounded in a worldview or ontology that held by the namers or the name users. Nomenclatures can, but do not always, rely on an ontology that informs the way in which people holding that ontology go about naming. The ontology may underlie the naming practices, or naming practices may codify an ontology that was implicitly contained in the language used for naming. The ontology may also change as a result of the way people use the nomenclature or employ it at a particular time or within a particular environment. So investigating the relationship between nomenclature and ontology means investigating how or in what ways ontologies provide grounding or anchoring for names, as well as how they are impacted by naming conventions. In questioning the relationship between names and ontologies in studies by ethno-lichenologists, we may ask how information contained in vernacular naming practices is accessible or even translatable to those holding different ontologies. So rather than taking biological names to be the object of my study, I focus instead on activities surrounding the process of naming. So as a philosopher of biology, I'm interested in how those things that are named become named, by whom, and on the basis of what. Naming is an instance of kind of making kinds, or if we want to verb it, kinding. We can understand the naming process in terms of our reaching out into the world to linguistically grasp that to which is of interest to us. This grasping may be best understood as a kind of agent-centered realist approach to understanding. The name then is real if it successfully refers to the object for which it was intended by the individuals naming it. As a process of kinding, it is grounded in the purposes for which the investigator is seeking to kind, the apt use of methods and tools chosen for the investigating the putative kind, and their responsiveness to current and past communities of kind makers. So to put it another way, the reality of biological names supervenes on the naming practices that people use, ontologies that they rely on to name, and the purposes for which they are naming. In this way, naming practices in particular and kinding more generally provide the investigator a route to knowledge about a portion of the world. So this may sound the more philosophical bit, right? Maybe before it was a little bit biological. So this is kind of an agent-based realism. It's something that can be seen in Misvita Chiramutu's notion of haptic realism, where she uses this as a perspectival approach to vision research, Michaela Massimi's naturalized Kantianism, and Uliana Feist's operationist approach to research in short-term memory. So for Chiramutu, the word haptic is intended to elucidate the sort of relationship that yields knowledge by the investigator of that which is being investigated. She suggests that our knowledge is the result of our attempting to touch or have a feel for that particular phenomena to which we are attending. She writes, because the sense of touch requires contact and purposeful exploration on the part of the perceiver, it is obvious that with touch one apprehends an extradermal reality in virtue of, and not in spite of, its interactive and interested nature. I will investigate how naming practices inform the groups that use them about the world in virtue of their interactive qualities. And so these are some of the literatures that I'm relying on. So very interdisciplinary, both history and philosophy of biology, as well as from these other areas that are quite different in ethnobotany and vision research. Okay, so studying the formal naming practices of lichenologists, we find that although lichens are understood to be symbiotic systems, the two parts of the lichen, the mycobiont and phytobiont, are not actually treated equally when it comes to their role in lichen naming. Prior to 1950, lichens were given names as whole organisms. For instance, in 1939, Eugen Thomas suggested that lichen symbionts be assigned a specific nomenclature that was distinct from the nomenclature of its fungal or algal partner. Thomas's specific recommendation was to use the lichen name only as a name for lichens. The lichen fungi are to be named by the genus name of the lichen ending with myces, or the species name of the lichen in the genitive. So these alternative naming practices, although they seemed good, were ultimately rejected and the convention for naming lichens as separate from their fungal or algal partners was halted in 1950 with the Code of the Botanical Nomenclature grounded the nomenclature of the lichen symbiont to its fungal partner. So in Article 76, it states that for nomenclatural purposes, names given to lichens shall be considered as applying to their fungal components. A lot of lichenologists were not impressed by this, but despite ongoing criticism, the 1950 Lichen Fungal Naming Convention, it remains that the fungus and not the algae or the cyanobacteria that is used to name and track lichens. So this is even more a little bit weird because lichen names are usually thought to be the only real names for organisms. Although we use vernacular names like cotton, and they may be used informally, it's not accepted in the way in which the Linnaean name, like Gossypium hirsutum, is, as a true scientific name, one based on phylogenetic relationships rather than those for practical purposes. Scientific names are names that are usually thought to be those names that people in all parts of the world can use rather than being used in a particularly local way, or by a particular set of people with a particular set of histories or interests. So these are usually thought to be in contrast to vernacular naming practices. So to suggest that we cannot name lichens is correct in some sense. If that is that if we take the Linnaean name to be the only name that we could have. But of course, we can have and continue to use vernacular names for lichens. These are the names that refer to the whole lichen, what's called the lichen thallus, that thing that we can recognize morphologically as a lichen, and the names that we find in field guides or websites devoted to lichens and their admirers. Yes, these do exist, and many are Instagram-worthy. A couple of folks are actually looking at this, particularly one of which is Trevor Goward, who says, this is striking, because only in the common names is the human mind actually permitted unequivocally to touch the lichen thallus. Lungwort really is a lichen in the same way that Abies lasiocarpa is really a tree. So I pursue this investigating how it is that different peoples grasp lichens through vernacular and gray nomenclatures. So I said a bit about gray nomenclatures. I wanted to explain a little bit what that referred to. So provisional names and gray nomenclatures provide different ways of naming that aim to reflect the interests of the scientific communities that use them. They are meant to reflect diverse epistemic and ontological commitments. The stability of these provisional names and gray nomenclatures within these communities often depend on how names are created, how they are used, and what rules are followed in their naming. Alessandra Minnelli suggests that although gray nomenclatures can be useful, employing inconsistent naming techniques that can lead to ambiguities. He suggests that this has happened in a number of cases, one of which I have up here, in a conspectus on the Anopheles mosquito species. The author states that these extra names are meant to aid researchers and students who are interested in analyzing species relationships, but they include 444 formally named and 40 provisional named species. He complains that some of these are misclassified and others include provisional names that are potentially ambiguous, just naming them as species A, B, C, or D. So in an attempt to avoid this kind of ambiguous naming, while wanting to preserve the use of gray nomenclatures, which he thought was important to do, Minnelli suggests 3 requirements that should be met when using non-Linnaean nomenclatures. Develop a method to test with diverse rules how names are created and how they are used in order to ensure universal understanding and eliminate ambiguous naming. state a procedure for determining what it is that the name refers to, whether the name refers to an individual specimen or a taxonomic rank, and determine the means by which to compare names in different local studies or across ontologies. He thinks that meeting these requirements would provide a standardized format for non-code compliant names and rules for grain nomenclature that could be widely accessible. Okay, I shift slightly, you'll see the connection in a bit, from this idea of using these non-standard grain nomenclatures within institutional forms of naming to their use in indigenous naming practices. So here I turn to indigenous naming of the Sami people. So the role of local knowledge is an integral part of understanding ecosystems and communities, bringing together different knowledge systems with the goal of inclusion of diverse stakeholders that has been widely discussed in indigenous philosophy of science. What is less widely discussed is the role of local knowledge in the activities of local taxonomic naming practices. So I said I focus on the Sami. So the Sami, and this is a map of their lands. The Sami people live on ancestral lands in what is named the Sampni region of Fennoscandia, which comprises northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Murmansk Oblast of Russia. And they speak a Finno-Ugric language called Sami. The Finno-Ugric Sami language reflects much of their specialized knowledge in the environment and of their relationships with the animals that they herd, trap, and fish. In particular, the Sami have specialized names for the lands on which they graze their reindeer, as well as for the various lichen species that can be found on those lands. These names allow the Sami to differentiate between different lichens that grow at different times of the season and between those that the reindeer eat, which they prefer, which to avoid, and which they are willing to eat in times of scarcity. Many of these names derive from their relationship with the reindeer that they herd and their nutritional needs. The Sami language has a clear distinction between lichens and mosses. Distinguishing between these is valuable because whereas lichen are a source of food for reindeer, mosses are not. In addition to this distinction, the Sami distinguish between different kinds of lichen as to their nutritional effects on the reindeer. So this is from a prospectus in 1921 talking to one of the Sami, Jorgen Sara, who reports that Lapo, which is similar to, this is an older name, but a kind of beard type lichen, is not what they call yogel. Not at all, but a plant on trees, just as wool or hair on beasts. The reindeer eats Lapo and is actually greedy after it. It does not fatten on it, but it supports its life. Gadna is everything that is affixed to stones. This is the middle one. This is Gadna, and that's Lapo. There is much of it on the mountains and the peninsulas and in the islands in northern Finnmark. The reindeer eats it if no other grass is found. The most important is Soka Lapo. The reindeer eats it, but in our district, there is not much birch that it may become plentiful. The Finnmarken Sami group, the lichen names into three categories. So it's Yogel, Gadna, and Lapo. And this reflects their interest in reindeer husbandry. So Yogel refers to the arbuscular field lichens that reindeer eat. Gadna, which basically roughly translates to dandruff, refers to the scaly lichens such as those living on stones or on trees that were also eaten by reindeer. And the Lapo refers to the hairy-looking beard lichens that grow on trees. Within each of these categories, Yogel, Gadna, and Lapo, there are particular subkinds. For instance, among the Yogel, there are Botka Yogel, which are sometimes referred to synonymously with nanoyogol, which is angelica lichen, dublo-yogol, which is synonym is lasta-yogol, or flat lichen, hosta-yogol, or horse lichen, kruka-yogol, or jar lichen, Rhinos-yogol, or gray lichen, and many more. I'm not going to read them all. So this kind of terminology and the knowledge contained within it furnishes a means by which reindeer pastures can be differentiated in ways that are responsive to both changing environmental conditions and the interests of reindeer herders by providing a way of predicting when and in what locations certain lichens were to be found. For instance, Jorgen Sara describes how the grazing lands respond to fire, as well as noting the predictable succession of lichens that grow there following the fire. So nanoyogol is the first lichen that grows up when lichens regenerate in a field that has been destroyed by fire. It is the initial lichen. The dublo-yogol and the next smarva appear, and out of the smarva, topo-yogol and oiva-yogol grows forth. In this way, Sami lichen nomenclature practices provide not only the means to discriminate between different kinds of lichen in terms of the nutrient value they afford to the care of their reindeer herds, but also furnishes the means of ecosystem management by providing an understanding of fire ecology, the order of lichen regeneration, and the implementation of conservation measures. In terms of the latter, Sami protect precious lichen fields during harsh winters by moving their herds during these periods of time where overgrazing could endanger them. Although originating from Sami indigenous knowledge of land stewardship, the practice of moving herds during periods of extreme winters became much later on as a nationally regarded strategy against overgrazing in the US Department of Agriculture in Alaska in 1929. So I talked a bit about the naming practices of the Sami, but lichens can be found in tropical, in alpine, tundra, polar, and coastal terrestrial habitats in all 7 continents. Because of their worldwide availability, different peoples living in different climates have found that the lichen provides a much-needed resource. In a recent paper by Shiva Devota, they discuss 16 vernacular names for lichens among the Sherpa, Limbu, Lama, Tamang, and Rai groups in Nepal. Lichen are used in 6 different ways for medicine, ritual, and spiritual purposes, food, decoration, bedding materials, and ethno-veterinary uses. So very useful, right? Interestingly, and despite their varied uses, the most common name for lichen is yunga, which translates to unnecessary stuff, and yulo, which translates to brittle things for ignition. So apart from the general names, they were also names that were descriptive of morphological characteristics of the lichen and their palatability. Names widely used among these particular indigenous groups also include yangban, used by the Limbu and Rai groups, mangma, which means edible, used by the Sherpa and Lama, mayan, which means inedible, used by the Sherpa, and dakini chuao, which is witch mushrooms, we call it witch mushrooms, but they're lichens. So this is a very distinct categorization of their use among the Sherpa and Limbu and Lama. But Linnaeus wasn't so keen. Linnaeus's disinterest in lichens is kind of a widely discussed almost to the point of it being kind of the stuff of legend. But But he has been known to say that the lichen are the Rustiki paparimi, or poor trash, of vegetation. A comment that probably would not encourage us to kind of go and study lichens. In a short history of lichenology for the Bryologist in 1919, Charles C. Pitt writes, Linnaeus was no particular friend to the lichens. In particular, received very little of his attention. Evidence for this often given was that his herbarium includes a meager 93 sheets of lichens, and of the 170 known species of lichen at the time, Linnaeus only discusses 86 of these in his Species Plantarum. So whether or not, whether this kind of idea is well-founded or not, this feeling of devaluing among lichenologists persists. Naming lichens with fungal names has a significant effect on how lichen symbioses are and have been studied by emphasizing the role of one partner over the other. For instance, reliance on fungal evolution as the basis for lichen taxonomy brings with it a set of metaphysical assumptions about the structure and physiology of the lichen. One of these is that knowledge of the fungal phylogeny is sufficient for understanding the morphological and physiological differences between lichen. Many object that the overvaluation of the fungal partner is unjustified. Elizabeth Arnold and her colleagues studied other fungi present within the lichen system that were not the mycobiont. These endolichenic fungi are also part of the healthy lichen and associate closely with the algal partner, but are considered distinct from the mycobiont. These endolichenic fungi play a significant role in lichen evolution and speciation. Following Arnold, Toby Spreebel and his colleagues echoed her findings, showing that some lichens are not composed of two partners, an algal or cyanobacterial partner and a fungal partner, but also a third essential partner. The role of these third partners may be significant. He talks about the Bastiomyces yeast. And these are responsible for morphological diversity in the lichen cortex of some lichens. So there's scientific naming practices and evaluation of the whole lichen, as well as knowledge contained in the practices in use within the communities. And this, I think, is striking. Looking back to the mangma used to refer to edible stuff in the Sherpa and Limba, we can tell this. So knowledge was also contained in how it was prepared and as an ingredient in preparation of other foods. One of these is bread making, where the lichen is boiled, then dried, and then made into powder-like flour that is combined with another flour, wheat or barley usually, in a kind of 1-to-3 measure. The vernacular naming and use of different lichens for bread making may provide information into the chemical constitution of these lichens. Commenting in a recent Scientific American article, Spreebel remarks that the ethnobotanist Stuart Crawford had collected writings from around the world, ancient Egypt, modern Mexico, medieval Russia, biblical Middle East, and a cookbook in the 1950s. These all showed that people were using lichens to make bread and alcoholic beverages. In some cases, they were using them explicitly for leavening and fermentation. On some level, Crawford realized that people knew that lichens contained yeast and other endolichenic entities that functioned like yeast. When he was actually working for his master's degree in Victoria, British Columbia, Crawford actually discussed the notion with a local microbrewer and told him, if you can find out the recipe, I'll do you a batch of beer with it, which I don't think actually happened, but it's legend. So the local ethnobotanical knowledge may actually have provided early insights into lichen symbiotic metaphysics in terms of the use of certain lichens as leavening agents in local culinary practices. Understanding not just the vernacular names of the lichen, but how these lichens were used by them might have provided potential evidence for the existence of the Bassiamycete yeast that was discovered recently. So discovered in institutional areas, not discovered in, by the indigenous communities that had been using them from the beginning of time. So, however, in order to gain information about the presence of yeast that may be contained within the indigenous names, knowledge of these and how they are used as an agent of fermentation needs to be investigated further. Okay, so I said that that lichens are used globally. So I wanted to, since we've already talked about Finnmark and also many other areas, I wanted to talk about probably one of the most famous cases of use of lichen. And this is written, this is, I think, particularly important. So information about lichens and is contained in these indigenous nomenclatures, and it seems linked definitively with community ontologies. This provides information useful to understanding the function, use, and significance, and relational properties are necessary to distinguish it from another kind of lichen. So one of the most widely discussed within ethnobotany is what in North American English colloquially named black moss, or Bryoria fremonti. The black lichen, the black tree lichen is another way of referring to it, is morphologically nearly identical to Bryoria tortosa. And the thalia of both lichens is fibrous, dark-colored, entangled strands that hang down from coniferous species of trees. They have the appearance of hair that has been caught in the branches. Among the first peoples of North America, it is called willa, but it is called squilip by the Okanagan. Mourning Dove, who was an Interior Salish ethnographer and writer who collected many of the narratives of the Northern Plateau peoples, shares the Okanagan story of why the lichen was thought to be the braided hair of the hero trickster Coyote. She concludes the narrative, that was Coyote's ruling in the beginning. That is why his hair, the long black timber hair, hangs from the trees in the mountains. It is the black moss, the squilip, that people cook in pit ovens. So the narrative provides the meaning to the biological name, squilip, insofar as it explains not only the value of the lichen to the people, its use and purpose and preparation, but the narrative also provides a means of teaching people how to tell the difference between squilip and other species of lichen. This is invaluable knowledge, as the black tree lichen, Bryoria fremonti, is morphologically nearly identical to Bryoria tuturosa, but the latter contains vulpinic acid and is poisonous, whereas the other does not contain this poisonous acid. Despite the morphological similarity and ecological overlap of the species, the Okanagan can easily tell the difference between them. So although ethnobiological literature on lichens, their use and naming practices appear to provide an important resource for further understanding of lichens, a number of questions arise as to how this literature can be used. For instance, can we compare names and naming practices across diverse communities? And if so, can we retain the understanding provided by informal naming practices, whether in the form of institutionalized or indigenous gray nomenclatures, and the information encoded within them by the local communities? In order to answer these questions, we need to understand how information is coded in these communities and how names and naming practices are anchored in those communities. Careful examination of all of the above cases suggests that lichen naming practices rely on different kinds of commitments, epistemic, ontological, cultural, and economic, that make unifying the naming practices and the names that result from these into one set of synonyms or intertranslatable databases difficult. One purported early goal of ethnobotany was to do exactly that, to map so-called folk nomenclatures onto scientific nomenclatures by suggesting that both scientific, biological, and folk biological nomenclatures are underpinned by the same biological basis. That's Atran and Berlin in 1992. The assumption underlying this approach is that there is a real common cause that both refer to. As such, biological and folk biological names are commensurable in virtue of their referring to the same biological stuff. The approach seems to be supported in many studies where interrogating the meaning of terms relied upon to refer to a particular entity displays some sort of consilience in use and shares some properties in both nomenclatural systems such as transitivity or ranking. But the problem is not that these systems do not display transitivity or ordered ranking that can be compared to each other. Ethnobiologist Roy Allen points out this apparent consilience obscures the ways in which these nomenclatures are used. In particular, it obscures the way people interact with and experience plants in traditional societies, and it is rather different than the way a taxonomist in the Kew Herbarium interacts with them. This is not to say that a universal scheme that accommodates different taxonomies is impossible. It just means that this exemplifies only one purpose of ethnobotany. It captures the information from indigenous names that may be necessary to compare them to institutionalized formal naming conventions as synonyms, but it does not capture all the information that it contains within the folk names. So translating an indigenous lichen nomenclature such as the Samis into an institutional scientific nomenclature is possible. But the translation sometimes misses out on how someone is naming when they use the indigenous name. There might be something different about the way in which the classifier is naming, and they may be finding knowledge in a different way that is lost when what is intended is a translation of one organism name into one nomenclatural system into that of another. You might have noticed that I have included current institutionalized academic names alongside indigenous ones throughout my talk. This practice is widespread in ethnobiological literature, but what does it actually mean? Although the names are usually treated as synonyms with each other, we might still want to inquire into the nature of the relationship that exists between indigenous names and the institutionalized academic names that are purported to be the synonyms of them. We may ask whether the mention of both names alongside each other is a linguistic act that explicitly suggests that the two names are actually intertranslatable. It seems that in order to make a claim of synonymy between two names that is apt for the study at hand, it would be necessary to focus attention on one aspect of the name or naming practice and bracket off the meaning or aspects of it in order to make the comparison. If what was of interest was to compare different indigenous names of lichens, like those of the Sami, Sherpa, or Okanagan, what would be required would be knowing what to include and what not to include for the purpose of comparison. This, in turn, requires understanding how these communities actually anchor names, ground kinds, and use their ontologies very differently. So to conclude, comparing names across naming systems is possible, but the translation required to do so often leads to substantial information loss if the conceptual commitments relied upon to make the comparison do not reflect the ontological commitments of the namers and name users. This loss occurs because the comparisons never rely on whole ontologies, but are always selected partitionings of them. Synonyms, then, are therefore not synonyms in all contexts, but are delimited perspectively. That is, they are dependent upon the purposes for which the comparison is always made. So I just wanted to thank the Center for Interdisciplinarity, Michael Rourke and Stephanie Vasco, and also my awesome colleague, Kyle White, and another colleague across the ocean, David Ludwig. Thank you. No. Yes.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Kendig? I'm looking at you, Sephora.
Do we have 5 minutes to get a snack and water and think about the question?
Oh, that's what we do in philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there are no questions that anyone wants to pose in front of the audience, we'll be here until 1:30, and everyone here. Are you going to join us for a little bit after your talk?
Yes, because I'll have a cookie.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there any questions that you might have about Webster on this fascinating talk about lightning names? For one more time, but otherwise, let's thank our speaker.
It's a lot to process. Sometimes I have questions, I just need more glucose before I can word them.
Oh, hello. Yes, please.
Can you talk about the connection between the term ethno, in ethnobotanical, and the ontological? Since it seems that you made a case for like limited synonymy, and the idea of like, it has to do sort of with the autonomy. Lichens are complicated because we have recognized categories from which they're made up of that we think of as autonomous biological entities. So we know that fungi can live on their own, we know that algae can live on their own, and we know that bacteria can live on their own. And if they're made up of these, and there's nothing else in that entity that we know of, there's already a kind of hybrid concept there within that biological entity, and that seems to drive the nomenclature problems for the scientists who are trying to decide where to place them or how to understand them. When you think about indigenous naming practices, and you're positing a connection between ontology there, that there's, and you had that interesting moment at the beginning of the talk where it's sort of like, well, the entity is regulated by the Naming Act. It takes on its ontological validity in the act of naming, sort of like Adam or something like that, if it works. But then, what is ethno and ontological? Like, are we reducing the ethnicity to its ontological making functions there, or are we talking about a worldview limitedly applied to how they understand the use of that plant in their life?
Okay.
Yeah.
That's I will call that one question.
It's really, I mean, it's hard. I was just trying to frame it.
I know exactly what you're asking, I think, but correct me. So I think there's something kind of, how do I answer? Okay, so ethnobotany seems to be historically focused on indigenous communities and how they're naming things. And I think in making that move, it makes it seem as though scientific naming, there's going to be a lot of scare quotes. Okay, so like institutionalized naming practices, conventions, are somehow like off the hook, right? So they're not ethnobotanical. And I think that underlying assumption is what I'm trying to trouble.
Yeah.
And so that when we're looking at and I was using gray nomenclatures as an example of that, because gray nomenclatures are non-Linnaean. They're already diverging from like Linnaean accounts. So too, I didn't want to mention this, but like a lot of the ways in which other kind of databases are used, they don't follow these kind of rigid rules. And so they're already doing something that actually looks a lot more like what's going on in vernacular names, except some of the vernacular names have actually been doing it in a way that retains more information. So that all those hopes that I had about like Minnelli saying, in order to use these gray names, we need to make sure that they are unambiguous and that we can actually do comparisons. And the conclusion that I would have is like, that's not possible. If you do that, sure, you can have all these synonyms, but they're synonyms for a particular purpose, purpose dictated by the institution that's doing that, rather than actually displaying like full synonymy, which is probably impossible anyway. So like the idea of like, what makes certain things ethnobotanical and other things not, I actually think that is a bias. I think that there's, because if what we're interested in when we are looking at ethnobotanical research is how different ontologies play out, and in like the Sami, and like we can look at that and we can investigate it. We can talk to people and find out what are their underlying concepts and purposes. And then sometimes when I talk to biologists, they say these names have no ontological push. There are no ontological assumptions going on. We're just using them, pragmatically or for our epistemic purposes. And I don't believe that.
Well, it seemed like the elimination of ambiguity is one of their purposes, and I think you're trying to suggest that that's one way you might be masking, actually. I don't know if it's ethno, but it's certainly cultural. Certainly there's a culture of naming in the sciences, and there are certain agendas behind it. I don't know if they're tied to place and land in the same way that you find, or reindeer practices, or herding in the way, and indigenous naming practices often are tied not just to a species, but to a land, and that would be a difference, I think, that you could maybe successfully maintain between what Linnaean or gray nomenclature, which doesn't seem to have a place attached to it, where all these other ones do often have a place and place attached to it. Anyway, you answered my question.
Oh, good. Cool. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you for being here.
I didn't know anything about lichen before. Can't say I know as much as you now, but like so this is perhaps like this question perhaps doesn't like touch on the philosophy science behind it, because this is all new to me. But I'm wondering if you could speak briefly to how your argument about naming connects to work on indigenous sovereignty.
I always like your questions, anyway, because they're always hard. Okay.
Or if not indigenous sovereignty, then at least like the relationship between the settler states and indigenous sovereignty.
Yeah, so like I'm working on that. This is like, so there's a lot that I don't know. And so like I'm sort of like, this is my foray into the literature. And so I am in the process of like finding out more and more of like naming practices that are have been obscured by the ways in which philosophy of science works and philosophy of biology in general. So like, it's I want to, but I haven't yet. Part of the thing that's going on is like a lot of the literature that I was using was like based in like 1921 and like of a particular area. And so I wanted to be representative of different cultures, but then it also seems to be, I don't want to get into this way of like, oh, you know, everyone does the same thing, because they totally don't. So it's kind of like, I'm in the process of like trying to figure out what, which in particular I want to kind of pursue. So that's not answering your question, but it's like, it's just, it's a hope that I want to go in that direction, and I want to be able to join that conversation. I just don't feel like I have enough background in the literature to do that. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. I guess my question is kind of related or framing it, trying to frame it. I don't know if I understood all the pieces of your talk to that my question's accurate, but I guess related to both of those questions, this idea of who is naming what, and if ethnobotany is supposed to be following, essentially we have these plants and these different things that are part of a culture's ecosystem and their livelihoods and their way of seeing the world. And then you have a system that's trying to reduce this ambiguity and name it, perhaps. But is there some appropriation of knowledge through that process, or is there a like taking away those communities' value and their knowledge about a system by putting on a name that is not ambiguous? That doesn't capture. I mean, some of the names do capture that, I guess. But
Yeah. So yes to both. So like there's, when we're thinking about the Academy's interest in indigenous names, it has been quite extractive. And so it's like, we want to go and find out about Sami naming practices in northern Finnmark, because if we know about lichens, lichens are super sensitive to environmental changes, and then we can use them as a kind of a way of judging climate change. And like, that's a good thing, but the way in which it sometimes manifests is going into a community and actually asking them what are their, what are you using for medicine? What are you eating? What are those kinds of things? Because those are what we want to know, or these are the kind of indicators, the environmental indicators. That's what we want to know. And when they start talking about their burial rituals, or their use of lichen for decoration, which is all part of as important, the interviews kind of glaze off, and I don't really want to hear that, and you see that especially in this kind of early 1920s literature. It's very much like, what are the economic interests of using lichen? What are the medical interests of using lichen? And so it's sitting in this weird way, because of course the interest of actually having the synonyms is that so that you can go into community and then find it and extract it. So yeah, that's been a problem. And even in the ways in which the people that are being interviewed is kind of, yeah, it's uncomfortable to that's the nicest way I could possibly say that. But yeah, I don't know if that was what you were getting at or asking.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, framing is really hard because it's like there's all this stuff that's going on that seems to be, it's like part of it. But yeah, but the issue of synonyms, we'll just put this name's like right next to this other name because it's the same thing, is something I think we should question, because the nature of synonymy is not, it's not, there's not a one-to-one relationship. I mean, the generation of that term is not the same, and what we have is not just the name. The name is just not hanging out there in space. It's from something and from someone, and that fromness matters. So yeah, yeah.
So it's 1:04, I want to respect everyone's time and the speaker's time. So why don't we give the speaker another round of applause, and then if there are any questions, have some comments, please.
I'm around all day.